Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the frozen heart of Victorian Britain, a place where snow wasn't just pretty flakes on a Christmas card, but a merciless enemy that clawed at every crack in the walls and pressed into every breath you took. Imagine entire neighborhoods plunged into darkness as gas lamps sputtered out, fires sputtered lower, and families huddled together under patchwork blankets stitched from rags. This wasn't cozy winter. This was survival, when survival itself felt like a gamble. Before we set out into the storm, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you love these strange slices of forgotten history. And subscribe if you want more journeys that carry you back into the grit and shadows of the past. And please drop a comment below. Where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? I always find it fascinating to see who's tuning in late at night under a warm blanket, who's catching this early morning over coffee, and who might actually be watching from a place colder than the story itself. So dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in something cozy, and prepare to step into a world where one ember in the fireplace could mean the difference between life and death. Tonight's journey isn't about kings or crowns. It's about ordinary families, both rich and poor, staring down the same storm but fighting it with very different weapons. The wealthy had coal cellars, servants, and velvet curtains. The poor had rags, scraps, and sheer willpower. Together, their stories reveal just how fragile comfort really is, and just how far people will go to endure. The evening did not fall. It collapsed, like a heavy curtain dropped across the stage of Victorian Britain. By dusk, the streets were already smudged with grey, and by night they were gone entirely, erased by a sky that had decided to empty itself upon London, Manchester, and the towns between. The gas lamps, those watchful pearls that usually threaded along the cobblestones, sputtered, flared, and one by one surrendered. Their glass globes filmed with frost. Their valves stiffened. The lanes became corridors of dark where sound moved differently, muted by the snow, magnified by the wind. Snow did not sift down like card scenes or carols. It marched, flanked by gusts that prowled the alleys and shoved against doors, testing hinges and heartbeats alike. The first drifts hid puddles and stones. The next swallowed boot tops. A few hours later, the streets themselves were a rumour buried beneath a pale, rising land. Wheel ruts filled. Cart tracks vanished. Footprints lasted only a moment before becoming anonymous hummocks, each one another step in the storm's relentless advance. Inside, families shifted closer to hearths that suddenly felt smaller than memory claimed. A home is supposed to be a boundary, a skin against the world. Tonight, it was merely a thinner layer of cold between you and a greater cold. The wealthy felt the change as nuisance and foreboding, coal scuttles heavy, servants circulating, curtains drawn tight and weighted. They counted reserves, named rooms they would not heat tomorrow, and listened to rafters groan with snow, calculations in silk dressing gowns. For the poor, there was not enough arithmetic in the world to balance what was missing. Windows were papered instead of glazed. Roof beams bent when someone breathed on the wrong plank. A draft was not a draft, but a presence that walked the room at ankle height. They pressed rags into cracks. They packed straw around door frames. They set buckets where the roof would leak, when the next shift of snow found a seam and melted, only to discover the water crusting to ice inside the pails. Children were placed as insulation, small backs to corners, small hands flattening cloth against gaps, their breath making bright little ghosts in the smoky air. Outdoors, horses snorted steam that the wind stole. Iron shoes slipped. A delivery boy turned his cap backwards against the gusts and tried to keep his head down, then realized down no longer existed. Snow came sideways, up and somehow through. Somewhere a door banged open and then, impossibly, shut itself under the push of a drift forming in the frame. A woman peered out with a lantern no bigger than her palm and saw nothing but a sheen of white, like looking into chalk. It was not only light that disappeared. Edges disappeared, curb from lane, road from yard, path from ditch. People the storm found outside became fragments. Dark shoulders, a bent hat, a pair of hands fishing for a latch that wasn't where the hands remembered. A neighbour's shout arrived rounded at the edges, as if spoken underwater. The storm had changed the medium. Everything moved slower, sounded closer, felt farther, and the gas, unreliable on a good night in some quarters, had joined the enemy. With the lamps extinguished, neighborhoods slid back a century in an hour. Windows that might have leaked a coin of light now showed only the twitch of a hearth. Alleyways became wrong turns toward nothing. Those who planned to return after a quick errand reconsidered and did not return at all. When households gathered, they did so with a caution different from fear, the practical fear that squanders nothing. Accounts were taken. How much coal? How many sticks of wood? 2 loaves, 1 cut already thin. A heel of cheese. A jar of fat. A half-dozen matches, the good kind. A candle stub remembered in a drawer, retrieved with the small ceremony reserved for relics and precious. Ordinary things. Every family made a kind of map. Of the house, of the night, of the next day that might not arrive. The wealthy mapped zones of warmth. The poor mapped what they could burn. The wealthy assigned servants to watch hours. The poor assigned themselves, and if they had an hour to share, they gave it to the child whose fingers would go numb first. The wealthy worried about deliveries. The poor worried about breath, and yet in both houses, the big and the small, the same logic was spoken aloud. Keep the fire, keep together, keep still. Stay near heat, seal what you can. Don't waste the first night's strength. Snow is heavy and dread is heavier. Fold your dread like a blanket and put it where it will do some good. Some streets sang a little because someone somewhere believes a hymn steadies both voice and beam. Some streets stayed silent because silence takes less energy than anything else. All the streets disappeared beneath inches that were becoming feet, and the feet, to the mind, began to feel like a roof over the whole country. The storm had not arrived. It had settled, so on the first night without gas, when London's eyelids iced and Manchester's alleys blurred, the people did what people do. They inventoried, they adjusted. They made smaller the space they would defend, and larger the patience they would require to defend it. They turned in, toward the ember, toward the shivering child, toward the sleeping neighbor on the other side of a thin wall, and the old city, for once, felt the size of a room. The storm would teach lessons later. Tonight it did the simpler work, reminding every house that it was an island, and every family that warmth begins where hands meet. By morning the house had learned to speak. It creaked without moving. It groaned with the weight of a new geography pressed on its roof. The door, when tried, didn't open so much as negotiate. Hinges asked for a new physics. Light filtering through threadbare curtains looked like daylight remembered by someone else. In the townhouses where the brick was thick and the mortar didn't flake at a stare, the siege felt orderly. Servants moved as if on a ship, routines clipped short, voices lowered, hands full of scuttles and cloth. Drafts were hunted and shamed, with folded blankets jammed along the skirting. Thick curtains were doubled and pinned. The parlor was declared cold and abandoned to the enemy, its portrait frames and piano left to the faint whisper of frost forming on the inside of glass. Coal was measured in the bucket by feel. A fireplace that usually played ornament became a furnace with a job and a budget. Even here the house leaked its private anxieties. A long crack on the ceiling quietly widened. The tall window insisted on rattling, no matter how carefully it was belted. Somewhere in the walls, a pipe sighed in a way that made the butler pause. Nobody said collapse, but nobody stood under the wrong beam too long. In the tenements and labourers' cottages the siege was literal. Boards vibrated like thin drumheads. The window wasn't a window. It was oiled paper with a story to tell, creased, patched, beaded with a melt that refroze into knobs. The roof did not arch. It sagged, and the sag spoke a single sentence all day. Not yet, not yet, not yet. Families answered with wedges of wood driven under rafters and prayers driven into the gaps left over. Damp became a resident. Straw mattresses took on the storm as if they meant to save it, soaking up every drop until their weight turned sleep into labor. Where the floor met the wall, a ribbon of cold air moved steadily as a stream. The quick fix was as old as weather, rags stuffed hard into places too small to deserve the name gap. Newspaper, yesterday's optimism, was torn into strips and hammered into frames with the butt of a knife. A child knelt where a grown knee would crack the board, fingers red and nimble, learning the household art of making less cold out of too much of it. When the wind hit the house square on the gable, it felt like a hand pressed on the skull. When it found the corners, it whistled, and the house whistled back. Buildings mimicked the things that break them. Parts caught drips that became ice flowers in their own bowls. The bucket set under the worst leak required someone to rise at intervals and trade it for another. The youngest slept where the wind could not find them. The oldest slept lightly, the way old animals do, listening for the sound the house would make if it decided to let go. Light had rules now. Curtains opened only enough to prevent despair. The rest remained drawn because the frost that grew on glass, lacework lovely from across the room, was a thief up close, stealing degrees from the faces that admired it. Candles, even the cheap tallow ones that smoked and entered a room before their flame did, were hoarded and sparked sparingly. The hearth had to do most of the seeing. Food had rules too. The cold could keep meat, but the cold could also take the fire needed to cook it. Bread was cut thin. Broth was stretched to a new definition of the word. The wealthy wrote menus that were really equations. The poor ladled out what they had and called it supper with a steadiness that, if it couldn't thicken the soup, at least thickened the moment. And the house kept receiving visitors the family did not invite. Smoke lay down instead of rising, draw reversed by winds, by cheap chimneys, by damp fuel that wanted to smoulder and could not be persuaded to burn. Eyes smarted, heads throbbed. The phrase "open the door a little" fought the phrase "don't you dare." In the rich rooms, smoke went where it was told. In the poor ones, smoke went where it liked and slept where people breathed. Some defenses helped. A rug tacked to a wall became for a while a new wall. A bed dragged closer to the hearth became for a while a new hearth. People rearranged the plan of their rooms the way generals rearrange front lines. They shrank their world to a space they could warm and decided not to apologize for it. Everything else, dining rooms, spare corners, the place where a chair had once been before it volunteered for firewood, waited in the cold like a future they couldn't afford. The house under siege taught everyone their job. The butler watched the coal heap with a stare that counted. The mother watched the embers the way surgeons watch a pulse. The father listened at the joists for the half sound that precedes a break. Children learned the rotation. Feed the fire. Do not feed it too much. Fetch water if it still pours. If it does not, fetch snow. Melt it slow and do not ask for more. The baby's job was to stay warm in the middle. The baby did the job perfectly, and everyone envied the baby the one luxury the storm allowed: sleep that trusts other people. By afternoon, the snow at the threshold had shouldered its way up to the latch. By evening, the latch was a memory buried in the drift, and the door once a way out became mostly a question. If we open, do we lose more than we gain? In some places, the answer was no. A corridor was dug shoulder deep, a tunnel to the nearest neighbor's matching tunnel, and in the middle, two people stood blinking at each other in a white ditch, exchanging the words that matter. Are you warm? Enough. Do you have a little? We will come if... Night on the second pass did not bother with curtains. It settled in the beams and in the chest, and in the little spaces between ribs that register fear. The house creaked once more like a ship taking a swell, and crossbeams answered from their sockets, and the family beneath all that timber and snow glanced up, not because glancing up would help, but because glancing up is older than math. A House Under Siege is a book that writes itself in heat and breath. Turn the page too quickly and you lose both. Turn it slowly, and you might reach morning with a little left. Outside, the storm kept its own counsel. Inside, people learned how much room a body occupies when it's trying to be warm, and how far a room shrinks when it agrees to help. Fire became doctrine, not a metaphor for faith, but its practice. Lit daily, tended hourly, believed in even when the draft said otherwise. The hearth stopped being furniture the day the storm arrived. Now it was a calendar, a clock, a god that required offering and attention, its altar a grate. In the houses with coal cellars, the rite was abundant at first. Rooms bloomed with steady heat, different from the quick fret of wood. Ash fell fine and predictable. Servants carried scuttles like censers, adding black lumps with the ceremony of people who know the cost of waste. Already they had been told which rooms would go cold tomorrow. The master wanted the library and the bedrooms, the mistress the nursery and her small sitting room. They compromised because marriage does when winter asks. Corridors became arctic. Doors were kept shut like secrets, and everyone learned to walk a little faster between the warm islands. But even where the cellar was generous, the numbers pressed. Deliveries had stopped. The coal that fed this evening's cheerful blaze was also next week's heat and the week after's. Voices in the servants' hall discussed consumption the way doctors discuss a patient. How much yesterday? What do we risk today? Who sits awake tonight and stokes at 2 at 4? Where there was no coal fires, theology was tougher. The liturgy was improvisation. Dried sticks, if dry existed, went first. Crate boards were excellent. If you knew a crate that would not be missed. Broken chairs had grains that flared hot, and then were gone. A drawer, pulled and emptied, could spend its second life warming the hands that once rifled through it. A banister burned beautifully, but banisters do not like to be consulted. They insist on architecture. Still, by the third day, more than one staircase had learned its new duty, one rung at a time. The poor learned again the difference between flame and heat. Damp wood makes flame because flame is easy, but it will not give itself over to heat without complaint. Rag kindling gives both but steals air as it smokes. Dried dung burns patient and long but must be begged to light. A house that leaks at the cracks also leaks at the chimney. A cough in the room often means the fire is telling you it wants a better route to sky. In the best houses, the flue obeyed the mason's skill. In the worst, the flue was a rumour, a diagonal hole aspiring to be vertical. Fire demanded method. The good embers, coals with lives of their own, were banked like savings, drawn over and hidden under ash at night to hold their glow until morning. A poker wasn't an iron stick, but a wand, part stirring, part coaxing, part warning against our human urge to meddle until the thing we love goes out. Too much lifting, and the heat fled up the chimney. Too little, and the core sulked and died. Children watched a parent's hands and learned a dialect, no book records, how to turn, how to feed, how to leave alone. Matches cost. Flint and steel cost time and calm. Kindling cost trips outside, where numb fingers made fools of fine plans. So the true currency was continuity. Do not let the line of heat break between last night and this morning, between breakfast and dusk. In the rich rooms, a housemaid learned the rhythm, her own sleep fractured into warm slivers. In the poor rooms, a father took the first shift, a mother the second, an older child the third, because no one else could keep their eyes open. The baby slept, swaddled, dreaming dreams that remember warmth. Smoke was the shadow side of belief. In the cottages that had the wrong chimneys or no chimneys, the gift of heat arrived with a tax on lungs. The closer you sat, the warmer you were and the more you inhaled. Children coughed until mothers rubbed their backs. Old men wheezed and kept silent, because wheeze was the price of keeping the little ones from shivering. Nobody called it consumption this week. They called it later, and later would be paid when roofs were dry and streets were passable, and doctors could be afforded, which was to say never or not in time. The fire also asked for fear. It could die. Embers could sulk into grey. A spark could land where straw waited. A moment's carelessness could teach everyone the swift arithmetic of loss. Yet, for all its risks, fire was the only line between the family and the indifferent mathematics of cold. The storm wanted every room the same temperature. The hearth insisted on difference. Around it, faces flushed. 2 steps back, breath steamed. Across the room, ice traced maps on the panes. By the third night, belief had matured into custom. A lump of coal was turned in a certain way. A door was opened to the width of 2 fingers and closed on a count of 5. The poker rested precisely here, not there, because here meant the child wouldn't trip, and there meant the parent wouldn't reach too far in the dark. Rituals do not require priests, only repetition and stakes. Here were both, and still others needed fire more. A neighbor's flame had failed, and the one thing heat teaches is that warmth loves a path. A clay pot lined with ash was brought, and a coal, glowing like a small heart, was laid inside and carried across the cold to be born again in the grate next door. A gift not of charity but of kinship. You keep your fire. We keep ours. Between us is a road of glow. In a city short on gas and long on winter, the hearth did not simply warm bodies. It ordered life. Tasks arranged themselves around it. Conversations bent toward it. The day ended when it allowed the last log, and began again when it consented to give its red to new sticks. Faith is often what you tend because losing it is unbearable. In these rooms, faith had a color and a sound, the low murmur of burning, the soft slump of fuel becoming something else, and every house, great or mean, worshipped according to its stores. Scarcity arrives quietly. At first, a fire is indulgent, logs stacked high, coal shoveled deep, flames fat with luxury. But the storm lingers, and each morning the cellar seems shallower, the woodpile meaner. People begin to count not in pounds but in hours of heat. In wealthier homes, The calculation is still civilized. We can keep the dining room and the nursery warm, but the music room must go dark. Servants carry scuttles with more ceremony now, as though presenting relics. Each trip down the steps to the coal bins is a prayer. Please let the pile still look large. It never does, for the poor arithmetic sharpens. There is no cellar, only corners of sheds or a basket behind the door. When the last stick is gone, I scan the room itself. A stool with a split leg, a crate from the grocer, a shutter already half broken by wind. Furniture becomes fuel, one piece at a time. Each sacrifice is made with muttered promises. We will mend it when spring comes. But spring feels farther than the moon, and then there are the terrible choices. Do you burn the wooden spoon that stirs the porridge? The door to the pantry? The shelves that hold the crockery? Each item destroyed reduces tomorrow's comfort to buy one more hour tonight. It is a kind of cannibalism, the house consuming itself. Meanwhile, embers are coaxed like reluctant children. Ash is not waste, but blanket, heaped to keep the smallest glow alive till dawn. In the silence between gusts, the poke of iron on coal is a sacred sound. People lean close, eyes watering, willing the flame to catch. When it does, the room exhales as one body, but the fire grows thinner, like soup stretched with water. Heat does not reach the corners. The bed nearest the grate is fought over, while the bed farthest away feels like a tomb. And so the storm teaches its first bitter lesson. Wealth burns slow, poverty burns fast, but all fires shrink. When fuel fails, bodies become furnaces. The old knowledge, older than coal, older than houses, returns. We are warmest together. Children are pulled between parents, wrapped in shawls that smell of smoke and wool. Infants are carried under coats, skin to skin, so that a mother's body must be both bed and blanket. Teenagers huddle resentfully, then gratefully, as the frost reminds them that independence can wait for summer. Whole families abandon separate rooms, crowding into one chamber like pilgrims. Beds are shoved together. Pallets are rolled out. At night the house sounds different, less creaking of boards, more chorus of breath. Some families even invite neighbors, turning one room into a dormitory where coughs, whispers and snores mingle. And not only humans, animals too. In cottages, goats are tethered near the hearth. Pigs grunt in corners, hens roost on rafters, dogs curl against children's feet. The smell is ripe, the floor a confusion of straw and manure, but warmth rises from every living body. A farm becomes a furnace. There is shame at first. Are we reduced to this crowding like beggars? But shame cools quickly when frost forms on the pillow. Soon, closeness becomes custom. A hand reaches in sleep to check another's pulse of warmth. Parents wake at night to feel their children's faces, searching for the terrible stillness that means cold has won. Stories are told to distract from shivering. Hymns are sung because sound feels warmer than silence. Someone remembers tales of Arctic explorers, how they survived by embracing in their tents. It comforts to think that what is happening in a Manchester alley is the same technique used on polar seas. Thus, a different kind of fire glows, the heat of humankind. Thin, smoky flames may falter, but as long as bodies press close, life holds. In ordinary winters, blankets were humble things, stitched from scraps, traded at markets, sometimes inherited. During the storm, they became fortresses. The wealthy wrapped themselves in heavy quilts of goose down, edged in satin, weighty as promises. They smelled faintly of cedar chests and lavender sachets. When drawn up to the chin, they held back the draught and offered the luxury of forgetting for a while that the world outside was lethal. For the poor, blankets were anything but uniform. They were patchwork, old coats cut into squares, sacks unpicked and resewn, shawls frayed into strips and layered. Some were so heavy they bent the cot beneath them, stitched from generations of rags. Others were so threadbare that holes admitted the very wind they meant to bar. Mothers spent daylight hours mending them yet again, needles trembling in numb fingers. Every stitch was a defense line in a private war against cold. When wet, they froze stiff as boards. When dry, they itched with fleas. Yet they were loved. A family might own only two, passed from bed to bed depending on who shivered most. Children fought sleep not because they were restless, but because they waited their turn under the one real cover. In the candle's glow, the patchwork showed its history. A square from a soldier's coat, a sleeve from a dress long outgrown, a strip of curtain once bright with pattern. Each piece told of better seasons. Now all those memories were conscripted into service, stitched into a single armor against winter's siege. Blankets became metaphors spoken aloud. We are under one quilt together. This rag will keep us yet. In the worst hours, a child whispered, "Don't take it away." And no one did. Because in those nights a blanket was more than fabric. It was survival sewn from yesterday. Hunger crept in more slowly than cold, but it was no less relentless. At first, families ate as they always had, just closer to the hearth, grateful for hot broth and bread toasted on the iron grate. But after 3 days of snow without delivery, larders began to echo. The wealthy measured out portions, servants slicing meat thinner, stretching roasts across more meals. Soups became thinner too, each day's pot holding a little more water and a little less substance. Still there was food, salted beef, tins of preserved fruit, jars of jam lined up like loyal soldiers. Enough perhaps if rationed carefully. The poor had no such ranks of jars. By the 3rd day, crusts of bread were gone. By the 5th, only bones remained, boiled once, twice, thrice, until they gave nothing more than cloudy water. Families scoured corners for forgotten carrots, half-spoiled potatoes, onions shriveled to husks. Children licked pans clean. Hunger changed the body. It slowed thought, made tempers short, made movements heavy. A father spent an hour staring at the cupboard, as if willpower alone could summon food. Mothers tore stale loaves into pieces so small they resembled communion wafers, doling them out with solemnity. Desperation whispered cruel suggestions: gnaw the leather strap. Scrape wallpaper paste. Catch rats bold enough to dart across the room. In some alleys these were not jokes but practices. Day a pot of boiled rat shared among 6 was better than nothing, and nothing was the alternative. The wealthier spoke of inconvenience. The poor spoke less, conserving words as they conserved crumbs. In every house stomachs growled through the night, a reminder that fire was not the only god demanding sacrifice. Warmth carried its own poison. Fires built from damp wood or rubbish did not burn clean. They smouldered, coughing black plumes that clung low to the floor. In cottages with faulty chimneys, smoke lay heavy as fog. Children's eyes watered. Infants hacked, small bodies racked with coughs too large for their frames. Mothers held cloths over mouths, though cloth itself smelled of ash. Old men leaned against walls, wheezing, unable to draw a full breath. Doctors called it bronchitis, pneumonia, consumption. The poor called it winter's tax. They knew the sound, the rattle deep in the chest that meant a cough would never leave. Once it started, it spread through the family like fire through kindling. In wealthy houses, chimneys drew properly, though even there the servants suffered. Hours spent feeding fires meant hours inhaling smoke. Red eyes and raw throats became part of their uniform. The storm outside froze lungs. The smoke inside scorched them. Together they turned every breath into a gamble. Was it better to choke by the fire or freeze by the window? Few had the luxury of choosing. At night, silence was treasured. Yet sometimes silence meant the worst thing. A cough stopped, not because the sickness ended, but because the body did. Families listened in the dark, fearing both the hacking noise and the absence of it. Smoke was invisible in the dark, but its mark was plain: soot-streaked walls, blackened ceilings, and children with cheeks smeared not only with ash, but with fever. Warmth had saved them from frostbite, but it was warmth laced with a slow, deadly price. Night no longer meant rest. It meant duty. The storm had restructured the hours, and in this new order, sleep was a privilege, not a guarantee. Every household knew that the difference between dawn and death lay in the hearth's ability to cling to its glow. The fire was a living creature, temperamental, hungry, and easily offended. If it was left alone too long, it sulked into ash and silence. Matches were too precious to waste, kindling too scarce to squander. So the family rotated in vigil. Someone, always someone, must sit near the grate, poker in hand, eyes red with smoke and exhaustion. In wealthier homes, this burden fell to servants. A maid curled on a stool, cloak pulled around her, fighting sleep with every blink. At midnight, she stirred the coals, added coal dust or a measured scoop from the scuttle, and whispered encouragement as if the fire could hear. At 3 in the morning, the butler made his round, ensuring embers glowed, lids of stoves properly shut. Their masters dreamed in feather beds, the rhythm of their breath unbroken, while below stairs tired hands kept their dreams alive. In poorer cottages, there were no servants. The family divided the night into watches. Father took the first, sitting cross-legged before the hearth, boots steaming as the snow melted from the soles. Mother took the second, whispering a prayer as she coaxed a stick into flame. When her eyes grew heavy, she shook the eldest child awake. A boy of 10 rubbed his eyes, sat down, and learned what it meant to be responsible for everyone's lives. Sleep was shallow, broken. Each person who lay down did so with one ear open for the scrape of poker, one eye flickering at the firelight. Dreams came filled with sparks and ash. The mind, even in slumber, circled the same worry. Will the embers hold? The hearth was no longer a place of comfort. It became a command post. The person on watch listened to the weather's assault, gusts that made the chimney moan, snow slapping against shutters, rafters groaning under white weight. They listened too for the change in breathing from the beds. A child coughing, an old man wheezing, the silence that was worse than either. In some homes the fire dimmed too far. Panic lit the room faster than flame. Bellows pumped, rags were waved, scraps of precious kindling sacrificed to save the ember. When the flame caught again, everyone exhaled as though they themselves had been relit. It was victory snatched from the edge of disaster. Stories grew around these vigils. Families told tales to keep children awake during their watch. Of Arctic explorers who survived by fire, of soldiers who froze when their campfire died, of saints who carried flame through storms. Each story reinforced the rule: as long as the fire burns, so do we. The night stretched long. Hours slowed to the rhythm of the poker's scrape, the sigh of logs collapsing into coals. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the hearth muttered. Between them lay the fragile thread of survival, guarded by weary eyes and stubborn hands. And when dawn finally bled grey into the room, those on watch did not collapse into sleep. They felt instead a stern pride. They had kept the covenant. The fire lived. The family lived. For one more day, morning revealed the enemy's handiwork. Where windows should have framed the world, they instead held panels of ice. Frost crawled across the glass in delicate lace, beauty masking cruelty. At first glance it looked enchanting. Fern-like patterns spiraled, delicate feathers etched by invisible fingers. Children marveled at the frozen flowers, tracing them with fingertips until their skin burned from the cold. But admiration turned quickly to dread, for frost on the inside of glass was a reminder. The cold was not out there anymore. It was in here, seated in the walls, spreading across the panes, breathing down necks. The wealthy fought frost with thick draperies. Velvet curtains lined with wool were drawn tight, pinned with hooks to trap the warmth. Yet even behind such defenses, the glass glimmered white. Servants were ordered to scrape frost away with cloths dipped in warm water. But within an hour the panes were icy again, sealing the house in a prison of glass and silence. The poor had no velvet curtains, no double glazing. Their windows were patched with paper or oiled cloth. Frost bit straight through, curling on the edges of newsprint, furring rags stiff. Sometimes the cold sealed the paper to the frame so hard it cracked when pried away. Families stuffed yet more rags into the gaps, knowing it was futile. Inside, water froze in pitchers, milk hardened in pans. Bread left on the table stiffened like stone. The very air sparkled when breath condensed and fell as tiny crystals. In the worst cottages, sheets stiffened where sleepers' breath froze against them. A child woke with hair glittering white, as though he had aged 50 years in the night. Beds became fortresses. Families piled every blanket, shawl and coat atop themselves, yet still the cold crept in. Frost formed on walls near the bed, so that when a child shifted he brushed against ice. Mothers wept silently, unable to provide even the illusion of warmth. Fathers clenched fists at their own helplessness. Some tried desperate measures, heating bricks in the fire and carrying them to bed, only to wake hours later to find them stone cold. Others filled bottles with boiling water, wrapped them in cloth and pressed them between shivering children. But by morning the bottles themselves were frozen solid, cruel reminders of how thoroughly the cold had conquered. In wealthier homes, frost indoors was an inconvenience, a reminder to keep the fires stoked. In poorer ones it was terror itself. Frost creeping across glass meant the hearth was losing. It meant the thin walls were no match for nature. It meant that life inside was balanced on the edge of surrender. Children drew pictures on the icy panes with their fingernails, trying to turn danger into play. But their drawings faded as quickly as hope, erased by the steady advance of winter's hand. Frost outside is a season. Frost inside is a verdict. And in those endless days of snow, verdict after verdict was written on the panes of Britain's houses. You are not safe here. Not from the storm. Not from the cold. Not even within your own walls. When a storm buries the streets and every home shrinks to a bunker, loneliness bites as hard as the wind. Yet even in the cruelest winters, people sought each other out, and sometimes the only warmth stronger than coal was fellowship. Thus, in alleys and courtyards of Britain's poorest districts, the community fire was born. It began with one family dragging a bundle of kindling into a shared yard. Others emerged, clutching scraps of wood, straw, or even broken furniture. Soon a small blaze flickered against the snow, the smoke rising like a banner of defiance. The fire became everyone's to guard, everyone's to feed. Neighbors gathered close, faces reddened by heat on one side, stiff with cold on the other. Children stretched hands toward the flames, their nails rhymed with frost. Old women hummed hymns. Men swapped rumors, when coal wagons might arrive, how long the storm would last, which families had lost their embers. It was not just fuel that people shared. Say a pot might appear, filled with whatever scraps a household could spare. A turnip, a carrot, a bone stripped almost bare. Together they simmered into a thin stew, ladled out carefully so every mouth received a taste. The meal was more symbolic than sustaining, yet its power lay in reminding people that they were not suffering alone. Laughter surfaced too, against all odds. A boy mimicked the sound of the wind howling down the chimney. A girl made faces by the firelight until the crowd chuckled. These moments were not frivolous. They were survival in another form. But the community fire was fragile. Wood burned quickly and few could spare much. Quarrels erupted. Who had given too little, who had taken too much. Still, when the flames began to die, shoulders bent together to fan the embers back to life. Better to fight over a fire than freeze without one. When the storm eased, the yard lay blackened with ash, footprints frozen around the pit. The fire itself was gone, but the memory of it remained, a reminder that even amid scarcity, people could create warmth from nothing but trust, courage, and the need to be human together. Hunger is a cruel mathematician. It reduces families to numbers, meals to fractions, survival to subtraction. Every bite is borrowed from tomorrow, the wealthy households calculated with ledgers. Servants listed remaining stores, salted beef, flour, dried peas, jars of preserves. Each item was weighed, measured, and divided. Meals shrank by degrees, bread sliced thinner, porridge stretched with water, tea leaves reused twice, even thrice. Yet dignity remained, the arithmetic hidden behind silver dishes and careful manners. For the poor, arithmetic was performed aloud. A mother held up a heel of bread and counted, 5 mouths, 1 loaf, 2 days, impossible. She cut the loaf into pieces no bigger than coins, pressing each into a child's palm as though giving communion. A father boiled bones already boiled yesterday, whispering apologies to children who licked their spoons and asked for more. Some grew inventive. Wallpaper paste made from flour and water was scraped and boiled into a foul porridge. Rats caught in traps became stew, their meat disguised with onion or herbs if any remained. Others boiled leather, boots softened in water, sliced thin, chewed until jaws ached. The hunger arithmetic shaped every decision. If you eat today, will you starve tomorrow? If you feed the children more, will you have strength to work when the storm ends? Parents often gave up their own portions, wasting away while insisting they were not hungry. Children learned to accept lies told for love. And yet hunger did not only weaken bodies, it sharpened tempers. Arguments flared over crumbs. Neighbors accused each other of hoarding. In one Manchester street, families were caught raiding each other's stores, desperation overcoming shame. The storm had not just frozen the land, it had thawed the thin veneer of civility, exposing the raw mathematics of survival. When spring finally came, it was said that the snow had not melted, but had been eaten, one spoonful at a time. For in those weeks, food was no longer nourishment but arithmetic, and every family counted until there was nothing left to count. The streets of Victorian cities were never quiet, until the snow came. Then even London, which roared day and night, fell eerily still. Horses struggled first. Their iron-shod hooves slipped on ice, sending them crashing to the cobbles. Carts overturned, wheels splintering, goods spilled and instantly buried by drifts. Coachmen cursed, whipped, and finally gave up, leading animals back to stables where hay was scarce. Without horses, commerce froze. Shops shuttered. Markets emptied. The silence was uncanny. No rumble of wagons, no clatter of hooves, no calls from street hawkers. Instead, the muffled crunch of boots through snow, the occasional thud of ice falling from eaves, the mournful creak of shutters in the wind. A city that once pulsed with noise now seemed a graveyard. For the wealthy, it was inconvenience. Letters delayed, guests absent, luxuries undelivered. They paced parlors frustrated at the stillness. For the poor, it was catastrophe. Without work, no carts to drive, no goods to sell, no coal to unload, there was no money. Without money, there was no food. Hunger deepened. Snow became prison walls. Drifts blocked doors, alleys impassable. People dug tunnels to reach neighbors, shoveling with pots and pans. Children crawled through narrow passages of ice, their laughter disguising the danger. Some ventured out desperate. They wrapped rags around feet, stumbled down streets that were more White Canyon than thoroughfare. A few reached soup kitchens, where lines of gaunt faces stretched for blocks. Many did not return. Days later, bodies were found in doorways, stiff as statues, eyes wide in surprise. The streets had always been arteries of the city. Now they were frozen veins clogged with silence and death. The storm did not just steal warmth from homes, it stole movement from the world. Our house in winter is supposed to be a sanctuary, but during the Victorian storm it often became a coffin with curtains. The wealthy retreated inward. They abandoned half their rooms, sealing doors and hanging blankets across hallways. Families lived in clusters. The nursery, the drawing room, the master's chamber. Servants slept on floors to share warmth. They read novels by candlelight, played music softly, told themselves it was merely inconvenient. Yet behind the calm, dread grew. For what use is a mansion when snow piles against the windows and cold dwindles by the hour? The poor lived in one room because they had no other. Roofs sagged under snow, rafters dripping onto straw beds. With shutters nailed shut and doors buried, air grew foul. Fires smoked. Children coughed. Mothers stared at the ceiling, wondering if the weight would crush them before morning. Trapped inside, time warped. Days blended. Clocks stopped when oil froze in their gears. People measured time by chores. When to feed the fire, when to share the last crust, when to scrape frost from panes. Cabin fever gnawed at minds. Arguments flared over trifles. Who had taken more stew, who had let the fire falter, who had spoken too sharply. Some grew silent, retreating inward, staring at walls as though already entombed. For children, confinement was torture. They paced small floors, invented games with scraps of cloth or pebbles. They drew on frost with fingernails, only to see their pictures erased. Their laughter turned restless, then vanished. Even for the strong, being trapped was wearying. Muscles ached from disuse. The body, starved of motion, felt colder. The house seemed to shrink each day, walls pressing inward, ceiling sagging closer. In truth, the storm had inverted the meaning of shelter. The home that once promised safety now threatened suffocation. Families realized with grim clarity that they were not just surviving in their houses, they were surviving against them. Cold does not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, the prickling tingle at the edge of a glove, the glassy numb where a boot is thin, the small, traitorous thought, I can stand this a little longer. Outside, wind scours the lanes until they shine like carved marble, and the air itself seems edged. Inside, drafts snake along floors and climb chair legs, testing the ankles of sleepers. In both places, frostbite begins its patient work. It starts in the places farthest from the heart, fingers, toes, nose, ears, outposts supplied by thin roads of blood. When the body panics, it calls its soldiers home, tightening vessels so that warmth retreats from the borders to defend the core. The hands that gather sticks, the feet that tramp for water, the ears that listen at a door buried in snow, these are left to fend for themselves. First the sting, then the friendly lie of numbness. Pain is honest. Numbness is treacherous. Numbness says you're fine. Stay a little longer. Victorian poor learned the lesson on errand 1. A boy sent with a bucket to the pump returns with the handle welded to his grip, fingers rigid, a pale wax creeping under the skin. A mother, dragging a bundle of sticks through a drift, cannot later untie the knot she tied a half-hour before. A laborer, clearing a roof lest it collapse, climbs down and watches his own hands the way a man watches puppets, interested, detached, because sensation has gone on holiday. Indoors is not absolution. Drafts pass across sleeping bodies like cold hands, and the wall itself, sweating frost, condenses and steals heat from whatever it touches. A child rises from a straw mattress, steps onto a flagstone, and the stone drinks the warmth out of him ankle deep. Feet wrapped in rags grow damp, and dampness is a tailor that cuts clothing to fit the cold. Wet rags stiffen to boards that chafe the skin. The skin breaks, and the wind writes its signature in the wound. Treatment is a catechism passed among the poor, half wisdom and half myth. Rub with snow, someone says, but the crystals grind already fragile flesh. Plunge in water as hot as you can bear, says another, but much that is lost cannot be rushed home. The best practice is what the storm forbids: gentle warmth, clean cloth, time. The worst outcomes rise from what hunger and haste demand. The frozen hand thrust too near the blaze, the white toe pressed hard until it blackens, the wound ignored because there is wood to fetch and water to break from the well. Frostbite has a calendar of consequences. The first day, color fades to porcelain. The second, blister, angered skin like cherries set in snow. The next, purple bruise that will not decide if it means to heal. Then the black quiet of dead tissue, the smell that makes a mother turn her face so the child will not read it. After that, if there is any after, come knives and saws that were made to tame wood, not to prune people. Amputation in a cottage is an act of terrible practicality. A blade is heated because heat feels like cleanliness even when it isn't. Strong arms hold. Strong stomachs fail. The saw speaks its awful language, short, sharp syllables, and someone sings to drown it and someone else prays because there is no priest for this kind of service. Infection waits behind the door, uninterested in courage. A stump that looks well one day gleams with fever the next, and a family, already thin from hunger, sits up and counts breaths because breath is the only wealth left to tally. Frostbite is not only a thief of flesh, it is a burglar of futures. A carter without toes cannot keep his balance on a cart bed iced like a lake. A seamstress with 2 fingers gone can guide needle but not thread. A mother missing the tips of 3 fingers learns the new arithmetic of buttons, laces, spoons, and the baby's cheek. The poor did not have spare body to spend, and still the winter taxed them. The wealthy were not invulnerable. A lady's outing to survey the beauty of the garden under snow returns, with ears that sting to the color of currants. A gentleman's errand to the stable ends in a handshake that feels like shaking porcelain. But their frostbite is a scandal, a story for letters, a memory. The poor carry theirs like altered maps, territory lost at the edges, borders redrawn by a winter with no parliament. There is a final cruelty. Frostbite often spares pain, or delays it, luring its victims past prudence. Those who survive long enough to heal will say later that the worst sound of that season was not the saw, nor the wind in the chimney, nor the broom sweeping snow from a roof at dawn. It was the easy voice in the head that said, 1 minute more and the minute after that. When spring comes, it does not restore what winter has taken. The sun warms scars without smoothing them. But the living, altered and aching, learn new grips, new gaits, new ways to lift a child and a pail. They become cartographers of workarounds. If you asked them what frostbite taught, they would give you a thin smile and answer plainly, that warmth is a distance, and every step into cold must be a step you can afford to walk back. Darkness in the storm is not merely absence, it is substance. It has weight, the kind that presses on a room when the last gas lamp gutters and dies in its glass globe, and the lanes go blind. Even inside, the hearth's throw is a small circle, and beyond it the house becomes suggestion. Chair, cradle, door, all half made of shadow. In that thickness, a candle is not quaint. It is law. The poor choose tallow because they must, hunks of rendered fat, poured around a string and set in a tin mold, or else scavenged as stubs from better rooms, and remelted in a saucepan that already smells of onions. Tallow burns the way hunger eats, imperfectly. The flame smokes and weeps. It leaves a tear down the side of the candle like a seam. The air grows greasy, a kitchen that never serves a meal. Yet that small homely light writes the world back in, a mother's face, a child's open palm, the poker glinting like a promise. Beeswax, when it is lit in the houses that can afford to own bees without ever meeting them, burns like a prayer. Clean, steady, sweet. The room relaxes under it. Letters can be read, lace can be mended, the eye does not ache from the stutter. But even beeswax learns economy in a long storm. Wicks are trimmed. Flames are pinched and saved. A room learns to sit with half light, rather than squander the full. A single candle set before a mirror doubles itself like a trick and gives the illusion that the night has agreed to be reasonable. Lanterns travel. Tie a rag around the base to carry in wind, and a man can find a neighbor's tunnel, a path carved through the drift between doors that would otherwise be separate graves. A woman bends a metal shade to throw the beam downward, and for one precarious minute, becomes the mistress of a small moon she can move where it is needed, to the water pail, to the latch, to the face of a child who says he cannot breathe. Candles govern time. They decide when the story ends and the room must sleep. A stub 2 fingers long means 15 minutes of letters. A new taper means we can read until the paragraph concludes. In parlors with pianos, music dwindles to what can be remembered without scores because pages demand light, and a candle is not a library. In kitchens, the tally of wax is a parallel larder. The last stub is not for seeing to eat. It is for seeing the face of the person you love when they wake it at midnight and whisper, "Is it time to tend the fire?" Light teaches discipline. Children are told not to play shadow puppets, because a hand between flame and wall is a hand between flame and wicks, and rough play knocks candles and candles spill, and spilled tallow on a straw mattress is a fuse that does not ask permission. The poor learn to keep the flame low and the wick short. The wealthy learn to like the look of dimness, because liking it is cheaper than fighting it. And then there is the kindness of darkness. Candles go out on purpose too, snuffed by fingers wetted by brass cones, by breath that half prays and half saves. The room softens. Hard edges, broken chair legs, a gap in the curtain, are briefly invisible. People lie down and let the night do what it will, because there are only so many things human hands can tend in a 24-hour siege. The last glow on the hearth plateaued into a red thought, and the candle died, and the sentence of sleep was pronounced and accepted. In every class, in every room, light becomes moral. It is hoarded or shared, wasted or worshipped. It reveals and it deceives. Who among us looks not quite starved by the candle's flattering mercy? The poor learn to love the shadow on the cheek. That means their child still breathes against the wall. The rich learn to read their own ledgers by a light that looks like romance and feels like arithmetic. And when at last the city's lamps wake with a timid hiss, and night withdraws into the corners where it began, people do not immediately stop using candles. They light one for the pleasure of abundance, and then they pinch it out, because the storm has taught them the oldest truth of flame, that a small, faithful light is not only a way to see, it is a way to live. Alcohol walks the winter streets like an old friend with unreliable pockets. In the tavern, a low room furred with smoke where the door sticks from swollen wood, mugs move hand to hand as if they know their route without being told. Small ale is weak enough to give a child without much scandal. Porter is a blanket thrown over the belly. Gin is a match struck in the chest. In a week when water is fetched by hacking a pond and melting a bucket of snow to a saucer of liquid, beer is not a luxury. It is a way of drinking without dying of filth. The poor understand calories the way a miller understands grist. Ale carries sugar and a little malt body. It keeps a man on his feet when broth fails to justify its steam. A mother sips and feels the furious itch of hunger pause if not depart. A grandfather warms his hands on a mug as much as his throat. In some cottages, a brew of dubious pedigree ferments under a blanket near the hearth. Beetroot, barley scrapings, a fistful of dried hops begged from the brewery. It will be sour and sharp and honest. The wealthy prefer ceremony to necessity. Mulled wine barges into the drawing room in a silver pot, along with cloves and cinnamon that remember warm climates. A hot toddy wears lemon like a brooch and tells the throat to stop complaining. Guests brag with mock humility about cellars that will outlast the storm, even as their stewards count bottles behind their smiles. Spirits feel like medicine, because all medicines feel like mercy when nothing else changes the air. But the winter does not negotiate with spirits. It uses them. Alcohol gives a golden lie. Surface vessels open. Heat rushes to the skin, the face flushes, the hands tingle, and the drinker says, "There, I am warm now." Meanwhile, the core cools, the deep small furnaces banked by the body's wisdom are robbed, and a stumble into the alley becomes a nap in the snow, becomes a statue with a bottle for a monument. The city knows this story and tells it again. Found in the morning, a grin still in the beard, the pose of a man who thought he was only leaning for a moment. Taverns during the storm are emergency rooms for the soul. Songs loud enough to drown a cough. Arguments about nothing to postpone the argument about hunger. Men who would not cry in their own rooms cry here, because the noise grants privacy, and the keeper wipes mugs with a rag that has heard 100 confessions and absolved none. And yet absolution of a kind happens. For an hour bodies loosen, shoulders drop. Laughter stands on the muddy table and declares, ridiculous and necessary, that the world is not only suffering. Moralists walk by and shake their heads, and they are not entirely wrong. The penny spent on ale might have been spent on bread. The hour spent singing might have been spent sleeping. But bread is scarce, and sleep is a wall that caves in when dread leans on it. The storm teaches gentle judgments. A man who buys a drink for his neighbor buys heat for two, one in the throat, one in the thought that someone still counts you as worth warming. The worst of it sits quietly at home too. A father overpours his courage and wakes to find he has traded the night watch for snoring, and the fire is a sulk, and his eldest stares at him with the knowledge of the newly older. A mother who took a sip to steady her hands finds them steadier and then less steady, and then still, and only the baby's cry reels her back from the soft, dangerous coast where nothing matters. Alcohol is a tool like any other. Lift with it and it will help. Lean on it, and it will roll away and let you fall. When the thaw comes, taverns are the first to open their doors long to the street, letting wet air and relief inside. The songs change key. Some pledge to drink less, a promise as old as grapes. Others invite the keeper to baptize their new child with a name learned during a chorus. The city forgives what it can and remembers what it must, and winter records another ledger of lips warmed and fingers lost. Liquid courage, liquid risk. The cup that steadied many also tipped a few into the drift. And still, when a friend knocks at dusk with a bottle hidden in his coat, you make space by the hearth, because if the storm taught anything, it taught this, that a warm voice in a cold room is a medicine worth sharing even if the bottle is not. When weather breaks the border between outside and in, animals cross with the snow. The rich will say they have always shared their houses with beasts, lapdogs in ribbons by the fire, cats that never see rain. But what enters the poor cottage during a siege is not pet but kin, heat-bearing and literal. The dog comes first because the dog is already family. He circles the hearth and finds the place where ash has heated the brick through, and there he loafs like a dark loaf with a bright tongue. Children lay feet against his ribs and pretend they are not doing it for warmth. He pretends not to notice because dignity is a blanket too. The cat, opportunist and priest, finds the high warm place, beam, shelf, the curve of a sleeping shoulder, and needs milk out of air. Purring is a space heater the size of a kettle. Then the farm follows, a goat on a rope, her breath white, her eye ancient. A pig, clever enough to understand every word but too polite to answer, curled into straw with the snore of a small uncle. Hens like nervous old ladies cluck about the rafters, dropping opinions and other things. If there is a cow, she comes last, moving the way a slow river moves, no hurry, no apology. Each animal arrives with a suitcase you cannot see, heat packed in fur and blood, a mildness that softens the room's racket, and a smell that becomes, by the second night, the smell of being alive together. At first, shame. People mutter that a house is not a barn, but the moment a child tucks cold toes under the warm shelf of a dog's belly and sighs as if returning from war, arguments bow and leave. The goat offers milk as tithe, the pig offers radiant heat. The hens offer eggs if they feel like forgiving the world, and sometimes they do. The floor is a map of straw and prints and the small abrupt punctuation of chicken feet. The air is busy with breath. Work redrafts itself. Someone must fetch hay from a shed, where the drifts argue with the door. Someone must carry out muck in buckets that steam like kettles in the frozen lane. The child who learns to milk in a storm learns a patience that outlasts weather. The father who builds a screen from crates to keep a wet nose away from the baby's palate becomes a carpenter of kindness. The mother who can cradle human and kid in the same hour invents new lullabies that include everyone's name. There is a darker ledger written in the larder. Animals inside are comfort and insurance at once. A goat is warmth every day and meat once if it comes to it. A hen is a promise in a shell and a stew in feathers. Families postpone the knife as long as they can, because warmth tonight is gentler than broth tonight, and because the baby sleeps better with a pig's slow thunder at his back. But hunger keeps its own calendar, and sometimes a storm is longer than love's first line. When the time comes, it is done quickly, with apologies and hands that do not tremble because trembling wastes heat. In richer stables, servants double the straw, rub legs down, hang blankets over the backs of horses that cost more than a row of cottages. Dogs lie on tassel rugs and dream of rabbits, and cats wonder why the piano keys do not warm the paw. But even there, the boundary softens. A child slips from the nursery to the stable and presses her face to a mare's neck, and the mare, astonished at the small heat, turns and breathes tea and hay into the child's hair. In the ledger of winter, such exchanges balance more than the price of oats. When thaw finally smudges the edges of snow, doors are opened with celebratory clatter. Animals go out like sailors stepping ashore, stiff-legged, blinking, pleased. The house, minus its extra hearts, feels abruptly larger and colder, and the family speaks of sweeping as if sweeping could cure absence. Yet something stays, a habit of closeness, a respect for the quiet citizenship of beasts, an understanding that survival is a chorus sung by many throats. Ask those who lived through it what they remember, and they will tell you. The night the pig stopped snoring and everyone woke to the wrongness. The morning the hen laid an egg so warm, it felt like summer in the hand. The day the goat shouldered the child as if to say, "Stand up, little one." We all must. And if you ask what was learned, they will shrug as practical people do and say only, "Heat is heat and love is love, and a neighbor sometimes wears hooves." The storm did not merely exist outside, it spoke. To those trapped in their homes, it became a companion, a tormentor, and sometimes a prophet. Its voice was not one but many. It moaned down chimneys like a giant organ pipe, changing pitch as gusts shifted, filling rooms with tones so deep they vibrated in the ribs. Rafters answered with groans, floorboards with creaks, windows with rattles. Each sound was a question. Will I hold? Will you? Families listened as if the storm were speaking directly to them. At night the wind howled so fiercely that it seemed alive. Children woke crying, convinced wolves circled outside. Mothers soothed them, though their own eyes betrayed unease. The poor said the storm sounded like lost souls wailing. The wealthy described it as a wild orchestra, untamed and frightening. Snow added its own voice, a steady hiss as flakes whipped past shutters, the dull thump of drifts sliding off roofs, the sharp crack when ice broke under its own weight. Sometimes silence fell suddenly, and that was worst of all. Silence meant the storm was gathering breath, preparing for its next assault. People came to interpret the storm's language. A high whine meant loose tiles. A deep groan meant rafters were under strain. A muffled roar signaled that streets outside were filling with snow. Listening became survival. Fathers paced the rooms, ears trained like sentries. Mothers froze mid-task when a new note joined the chorus, and through it all, the storm mocked them. Its voice said, "You are small. You are fragile. You are mine until I choose to leave." For children, the storm was both terror and wonder. At first, they marveled at snow piled higher than their heads, at windows painted with frost flowers, at candlelit rooms where shadows danced. It felt like a fairy tale. But fairy tales have monsters, and this one's monster was hunger, cold, and confinement. Play shrank to the size of a room. Boys carved toy soldiers out of firewood scraps. Girls stitched dolls from rags. Siblings invented games of pretend warmth by drawing imaginary fires on frosted panes. Laughter came, but it was thin, quickly swallowed by the reality of shivering bodies. Older children were pressed into service. They fetched snow for melting, carried coal if any remained, took night watches at the hearth. A 10-year-old might be entrusted with keeping the embers alive, his hands shaking, his eyelids heavy, but knowing the family's life depended on him. Childhood blurred into adulthood overnight. The storm etched fear into them. A child who woke to see frost on the inside of his blanket never forgot it. A girl who heard her baby brother cough through the night carried that sound for decades. They grew up fast, tempered by hardship, their innocence stolen by necessity, and yet resilience bloomed. They learned to value scraps, to cherish small comforts, to hold family close. Many would later recall the storm not only as suffering, but as the time when they learned what it meant to endure. Childhood on the edge forged adults who carried the memory like a scar and a strength. For some, there was no hearth, no blanket, no family huddled together. Street children, already countless in Victorian cities, faced the storm with nothing but rags and courage. They slept under bridges, in stairwells, in doorways where the wind cut less sharply. But snow crept in regardless, covering their bodies until they looked like forgotten bundles. Many never woke. Charities and parish houses did what they could, cramming dozens of children into shelters. But there was never enough room, never enough food. The lucky ones received thin broth, a corner of straw, a candle stub for light. The unlucky ones pressed against each other in alleys, sharing body heat, whispering promises they could not keep. Tomorrow will be better. The storm was merciless. Frostbite claimed fingers, coughs deepened into death rattles, hunger hollowed their faces until they looked ancient. Yet they scavenged still, breaking ice from barrels for water, begging crusts from doorsteps, stealing wood from fences to feed small hidden fires. For them, childhood ended not on the edge, but in the abyss. They were the storm's first and easiest victims, their names unrecorded, their graves unmarked. But without them, the story of the winter is incomplete. For the storm revealed not only nature's cruelty, but society's. A world that allowed children to fight a blizzard without a roof above their heads. The storm did not halt work entirely. For the poorest, labor was not optional. It was survival. But work itself froze. Dock workers stood idle as rivers iced, ships trapped in place. Carters could not move wagons through streets buried in snow. Miners found entrances blocked, their picks silent. Builders' scaffolds turned into sculptures of ice, too dangerous to climb. Yet many still trudged out. Men shoveled snow from rooftops for pennies, risking collapse. Women hauled buckets of water through drifts, skirts stiff as boards, hands raw and bleeding. Children sold matches, rags, or coal by the handful, crying out until their voices cracked in the cold air. Factories tried to stay open, their machines grinding in the half-light. Workers shuffled in with numb feet, unable to grip tools properly. Accidents multiplied, fingers crushed, limbs caught in gears, fainting from exhaustion. Owners cared little. Work or starve, they said, as though the storm were an excuse rather than a threat. But even labor could not outlast the storm. At last, silence fell over industries, over docks, over markets. Families sat at home not only cold and hungry, but jobless. The storm was not just weather. It was an economic freeze, locking hands, wheels, and wages alike. When thaw came, labor did not spring instantly to life. Machines needed repair, carts new wheels, bodies new strength. Many who had fought to keep working were broken, crippled by frostbite or illness. They had carried the weight of survival on their backs, and the storm had stolen their wages while demanding their lives. They said the worst of the storm was not the wind, nor the endless grey, but the way it stripped people of their boots. Boots in Victorian Britain were more than clothing. They were wealth stitched in leather. For the poor, a single pair often had to serve an entire family in rotation. Children wore them to school if they went at all, then passed them to brothers for errands. Fathers trudged to work in boots patched until the patches had patches. Mothers walked barefoot around the cottage to save souls for the rare trip outside. Boots were heirlooms, burdens, and prayers. When the great snow fell and wages stopped, boots became luxuries many could not replace. Cobblers shut their shops, supplies stalled, and what leather remained in pawnshops fetched prices equal to a week's bread. Soon men walked out into drifts with nothing but rags wound round their feet, hoping the strips of cloth would hold against wet and ice. But rags soak quickly. Wool stiffens into boards, cotton freezes to stone. Within minutes, feet were bare again, skin pressed directly to the snow's glassy surface. Children sent to fetch water shrieked as the ice bit into their soles. Women carrying baskets sank to their ankles, blood seeping from cuts before they could limp home. Men digging paths between houses left crimson trails that quickly disappeared under fresh snow, their suffering erased as though it never mattered. The poor invented desperate remedies. They stuffed straw into stockings, binding it tight with twine. They tore linings from coats and wrapped them round feet, only to watch them unravel. Some tied wooden boards underfoot with rope, crude snowshoes that splintered after a few steps. Others stole shingles or broken slate, strapping them like sandals, clattering down alleys in misery and defiance. But no trick lasted long. The storm devoured every invention, leaving raw flesh against white. It was children who suffered most. Small bodies lost heat fast, and bare feet offered no defense. They cried out at first, hopping from foot to foot, then fell silent as numbness dulled pain into something worse. Mothers lifted them, pressing frozen toes against their own warm bellies, weeping at the sight of skin blanched white, then mottled blue. Some children lost nails, some lost toes, a few lost lives. The snow claimed them quickly without ceremony. Doctors, when they came, shook their heads. They spoke of frostbite, gangrene, infection. They prescribed rest, dry bandages, and above all, warmth. But warmth was the one medicine no one could afford. The wealthy could buy new boots, order slippers lined with fur, walk safely from carriage to parlour. The poor wrapped their feet again in rags, limped back into the storm, and prayed their blood would hold out. Eyewitnesses told stories long after. A man recalled trudging past the soup kitchen and seeing a line of children with bare, bleeding feet, stamping in the snow to keep sensation alive. Another remembered his sister collapsing halfway home, her feet torn open, her cries so faint they sounded like whispers. He carried her the rest of the way, but she never walked properly again. Inside the cottages, bare feet marked every surface. Blood-stained straw beds, leaving rust-colored halos where children had slept. Floorboards near the hearth were streaked red, reminders that even the sanctuary of fire could not undo the wounds carried home from the world outside. Mothers boiled water to wash them, only to see it freeze again in the pail before they could finish. They rubbed the feet with cloths, prayed over them, sang lullabies to drown out the sound of whimpering. But blood still came, and the snow outside still waited. In wealthier districts, stories of barefoot poor reached parlours and drawing rooms. Newspapers printed sketches of ragged children walking on ice with bandaged feet, headlines pleading for donations. Some readers sent money, others sent sermons. A few carriages rolled into slums, their passengers distributing old boots. But charity never matched need. For every child who received shoes, 5 more stood in line behind him, barefoot still. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Bare feet in snow were the storm's cruelest message, that poverty left people not just hungry, not just cold, but stripped to the skin, bleeding into the very ground they walked on. And yet, even in this humiliation, there was stubbornness. Men still trudged to find work. Women still hauled water. Children still fetched coal dust for pennies. The storm could wound their feet, but it could not make them stop walking. When thaw finally came, snow retreated to reveal the street's hidden record. Blood-dark patches marked alleys and lanes, where people had passed with feet cut raw. It shocked those who saw it, though the poor only shrugged. They had carried their pain in silence. Now the earth bore witness in stains. Boots reappeared in shops, cobblers reopened, leather could be bought again. But scars on feet remained, and with them memories. In years after, survivors told their children, never take shoes for granted. Never forget what it means to walk barefoot in winter. And children listened wide-eyed, not quite believing, until another storm came, and another generation learned that sometimes survival begins and ends with whether your feet are covered. For the storm had spoken clearly, in wounds and blood. And its sentence was written not in ink, nor in snow that melted away, but in the memory of every step taken barefoot across a frozen land. Cleanliness in ordinary times was already a fragile privilege in Victorian Britain. For the poor, soap was dear, water not always clean, and time for scrubbing scarce. But during the storm, the idea of cleanliness itself froze. What filth appeared? In those weeks clung not only to skin but to memory. Bathing required water, and water required fire. Buckets of snow had to be melted on stoves already straining to warm a room. Families rationed every drop for drinking, cooking, or dampening cloths. Washing faces or bodies fell to the bottom of the list. Days passed, then weeks, until skin grew grey with soot and grease. Children scratched at rashes, mothers wiped dirt with spit on their thumbs, fathers shrugged and pulled coats tighter. Clothes stiffened with sweat, smoke, and grime. Rags used. To wrap feet carried bloodstains that no boiling could remove. Bedding reeked of unwashed bodies, of animals kept indoors, of damp straw. Lice spread easily, scurrying between crowded sleepers. Fleas thrived in the warm cracks near the hearth, biting through stockings until legs were peppered with red. In the wealthier homes, servants struggled too. Laundresses tried to heat water in sculleries where pipes froze solid. Soap cracked in blocks too hard to cut. Shirts were reworn until collars yellowed. Gowns aired by open windows that admitted more frost than freshness. Ladies complained of stale perfumes. Gentlemen grumbled that linen never felt crisp. But these were irritations, not disasters. For the poor, filth was disaster itself. Sickness flourished in dirt. Cuts on bare feet festered when washed only in icy puddles. Children's coughs deepened as lungs filled with smoke and dust. Bed sores formed on those too weak to move, skin breaking down under sweat-soaked rags. Mothers scrubbed with cloths until their hands cracked and bled, knowing it was useless. And the smell. The storm had its own odor. And it was not only of snow. It was of unwashed bodies packed together, of animals steaming in close rooms, of smoke and damp wool, of chamber pots that froze before they could be emptied. The air itself seemed coated, and no window could be opened to clear it. Those who lived through it remembered the storm not only with images of white, but with memories of a darkness in the nose and throat. When the thaw came, washing became ritual. Rivers filled with families scrubbing clothes, women standing ankle-deep in ice melt, pounding rags against stones. Children splashed, laughing with relief at water flowing freely again. But no matter how hard they scoured, stains lingered, on fabric, on skin, on memory. For filth in those weeks had been more than dirt. It was proof of the body's defeat, of poverty's grip, of the storm's power to strip dignity as surely as it stripped warmth. Night in the storm was longer than night should be. It began early, swallowing afternoon in grey, and it lingered, refusing to end until morning was little more than a dim guess at daylight. Darkness itself was not new to Victorians. Streets had long been places of shadows. But this was different. This was dread. Inside cottages, candles were few, often stubs saved for emergencies. Families gathered close to the hearth, unwilling to move into corners where shadows pressed heavy. Children asked to sleep with parents, whispering of monsters in the dark. Parents soothed them, though they too flinched when the wind wailed in chimney flues like banshees. The dread was not only of the storm outside, it was of the silence inside, the moment when coughing stopped, when a child's breath could not be heard, when you reached out in the dark to feel for life and felt only stillness. Parents took turns watching, ears straining for the rise and fall of chest, hearts racing at every pause. For the poor, dread after dark meant fear of fire as well. Hearths banked with embers sometimes sparked into flames that leapt at rags or straw. Whole rows of cottages had burned in winters past, families fleeing barefoot into snow, their screams mingling with the storm. And so, people sat half awake, guarding against both cold and flame, knowing either could kill them before dawn. The wealthy faced dread too, though gilded by comfort. They feared thieves, prowlers who might slip into houses when streets were muffled in snow. They feared news from the countryside, tales of tenants dead in barns or farms ruined. They feared above all the unknown, the realization that money could not order back the sun or command the storm to cease. And yet dread also brought strange intimacy. Families huddled closer, whispered stories, sang hymns in low voices. Some discovered conversations never spoken in daylight, confessions, apologies, small kindnesses. For dread after dark was also honesty, the stripping away of masks when only the fire could see. Morning always came, pale and cold. But those who lived through dread after dark carried it with them, remembering the long nights when time itself felt frozen and every shadow seemed alive with menace. Snow is light when it falls, but heavy when it stays. That winter taught Victorians the terrible arithmetic of accumulation. Roofs groaned first. In poor cottages, thin beams bent like bows, tiles cracked, thatch sagged under white burdens. Families lay awake at night, listening for the snap that meant collapse. Some propped rafters with poles, others shoveled frantically, climbing onto roofs slick with ice, praying not to slip into drifts below. Still, many houses gave way. Whole rooms flattened, straw beds buried, lives ended in silence muffled by snow. In cities, warehouses collapsed, their vast roofs buckling under tons of frozen weight. Shops crumbled, spilling goods already too scarce to replace. Even churches were not spared. Stone buttresses groaned, windows shattered, spires snapped under loads their builders never imagined. Snow pressed down not only on buildings, but on people. Streets became trenches, walls of white rising higher each day. Children struggled to wade through, legs swallowed to the hip. Men shoveling paths grew exhausted, their shoulders aching, their breath clouds of frost. Every movement became labor, every errand a battle. The weight was psychological too. Snow buried hopes, plans, futures. Farmers watched barns vanish, their animals trapped. Merchants stared at stock they could not sell, wagons they could not move. Families measured dwindling stores and felt the snow pressing not just on roofs but on hearts. And snow silenced the world. Its weight muffled sound, smothered voices, buried laughter. It created a hush that was not peace but oppression, as if the earth itself were under a shroud. People whispered, unwilling to break the silence, as though speaking too loudly might bring more snow down upon them. When thaw finally came, relief was mingled with dread. For snow melted unevenly, sending cascades from roofs, floods through alleys, torrents into rivers already swollen. The weight shifted but did not vanish. It became water that carved new wounds, collapsing bridges, sweeping away what little the storm had spared. The weight of snow was more than physical. It was the memory of being crushed by nature, by poverty, by helplessness. Survivors spoke of it years later, the sense of heaviness that lingered long after the drifts had melted. For the storm had not only lain upon their houses, it had lain upon their souls. Warmth in the storm became a kind of currency, rare, precious, and meant to be shared. Where money failed, where bread vanished, warmth itself was lent and borrowed like coin. Families discovered that walls were poor defenses, but bodies were rich resources. Neighbors invited each other to sleep together in one room, doubling the count of blankets, doubling the firewood, doubling the heat of breath. 10 bodies lying close generated more heat than 10 fires could. It was simple arithmetic, but it saved lives. In Manchester's slums, neighbors knocked on doors with shy questions. "May we sit by your fire a while?" Often the answer was yes. Fires burned brighter when stoked with company, and voices carried courage that wood alone could not provide. A woman might sit with her baby at another family's hearth, nursing while strangers sang hymns to keep spirits from collapsing. An old man might be invited to share a bed with 2 children because his frail body still radiated warmth, and the children's quick pulses helped keep him alive. Borrowed warmth took many forms. Some shared heated bricks wrapped in cloth, passed from household to household like holy relics. Others lent out animals, a goat tethered overnight in a neighbor's kitchen, its body heat filling the room. Even clothing was lent, a shawl passed across the alley, a pair of mittens exchanged for half a loaf. There was pride too. Some refused help until desperation broke them, ashamed to admit their fire had died. But when they finally staggered to a neighbor's door half frozen, they were welcomed in silence, wrapped in blankets without questions. The storm stripped away divisions of pride and class, leaving only human need. In wealthier homes, the lending was subtler. Servants from poorer households were allowed to stay overnight in kitchens, permitted to sleep near the great stoves. Gentlefolk donated old coats or spare quilts, their charity reported in newspapers as noble deeds. But the truest warmth was not in donations. It was in proximity, in the decision to huddle together and breathe life into one another. Borrowed warmth saved many, though not all. Stories spread of a mother carrying her baby from house to house, begging for heat, only to have the child die in her arms before anyone could offer shelter. Yet others survived precisely because a stranger had said, "Come in, sit close, share our fire." When the storm ended, those who had borrowed warmth never forgot. Friendships deepened, debts unspoken but understood. Years later, men would point to neighbors and say, "That one kept me alive in the winter of storms," and neighbors would shrug, because in those weeks, warmth had not been charity but survival. A treasure passed hand to hand, proving that sometimes the richest currency is not gold, but heat shared freely among the poor. When all else faltered, when fires dimmed, food dwindled, and roofs sagged, faith itself became a source of warmth. For many Victorians, religion was not decoration but anchor, and in the storm, churches became both refuge and furnace. Parish bells, muted by snow, still rang faintly through muffled streets, calling the faithful to gather. People trudged through drifts, clutching lanterns, their breaths clouding in the freezing air. Inside, the nave was dim, candles burning low, breath rising in plumes above bowed heads. But it was warmer than any cottage, not because of stoves but because of bodies united in prayer. Clergy spoke words of endurance. They reminded congregations of Job's suffering, of Israelites wandering in the desert, of Christ enduring 40 days in wilderness. The message was clear. Suffering was part of God's plan, and endurance would bring redemption. Some found comfort, others despair. Yet all listened, because words themselves were warmth, and hope fed the spirit when bread could not. Families sang hymns together at home, voices trembling with cold but steady with conviction. Children learned to whisper psalms as lullabies. Mothers knelt by hearths praying over embers, treating every spark as divine providence. Faith also guided charity. Soup kitchens run by churches opened doors wide, feeding hundreds with thin gruel. Volunteers trudged through snow to deliver coal to widows, bread to orphans. They saw God's work in every act of mercy, and those who received help whispered prayers of gratitude, even if the soup was watery and the coal little more than dust. But faith was not unchallenged. Some cried out against God, demanding why he had abandoned them. A father watching his child's feet blacken with frostbite cursed heaven with every breath. A widow burying her husband in frozen ground asked why prayers had gone unanswered. Doubt spread like smoke, thick and choking. Still, faith endured, not always as belief in miracles, but as ritual, as rhythm, as the act of kneeling even when the knees ached. It was the warmth of candlelight in a church, the warmth of voices raised together, the warmth of hope that spring would come, and when spring did come, many declared it God's mercy. Survivors filled pews, offering thanks for lives spared. Priests preached of trial and salvation. Faith had burned like fire, sometimes dim, sometimes bright, but never fully extinguished. It had given warmth not to bodies, but to souls, keeping despair at bay until the thaw. When the storm finally loosened its grip, Britain did what it has always done in the aftermath of disaster. It counted. Numbers were demanded, statistics to explain what suffering alone could not. Clerks in parishes opened thick ledgers, dipping pens into ink that clotted in the cold. They recorded names of the dead, ages, causes. Frostbite, exposure, starvation, influenza. The columns grew long. Undertakers, overwhelmed, worked by candlelight, digging frozen ground with picks, coffins stacked like firewood awaiting burial. Families counted too, though their arithmetic was harsher. A mother looked at her surviving children and whispered the names of those gone. A father stood by an empty bed, tallying what the storm had taken. One son, one daughter, the strength of his wife, the hope of spring. In poor cottages, death was measured not in coffins but in silences. Chairs left empty, bowls unfilled, voices missing from hymns. Newspapers demanded figures. Headlines shouted estimates. Thousands dead in cities, tens of thousands across the countryside. Editors argued whether hunger had killed more than cold, whether children had perished faster than old men. Numbers became weapons, flung between politicians seeking to prove or deny blame. But behind the numbers were stories. A girl frozen in her mother's arms at a church doorstep. A family found beneath a collapsed roof, their hands still clasped. Miners entombed not by rock, but by snow sealing the entrance to their pit. Soldiers in barracks, their uniforms stiff with frost, their officers writing letters to widows by the dozens. The act of counting became a ritual of grief. Clergymen read lists of names aloud in churches, their voices breaking. Entire congregations wept, for nearly every family had lost someone. Bells tolled so often that they seemed to blend with the dripping of the thaw. And yet even as names were written, many slipped through the cracks. Street children with no families to claim them, beggars found in doorways, laborers buried in drifts. These were entered simply as unknown. They were mourned by none but the record keeper. Yet their absence pressed on the city like invisible weight. Counting the lost was meant to bring closure. Instead, it revealed the storm's enormity. For how do you tally not only the dead, but the lives broken, the futures erased, the dreams smothered? No ledger could contain such numbers, and so survivors carried them in memory, each step into spring shadowed by the silent arithmetic of grief. When the storm finally loosened its grip, Britain did what it has always done in the aftermath of disaster. It counted. Numbers were demanded, statistics to explain what suffering alone could not. Clerks in parishes opened thick ledgers, dipping pens into ink that clotted in the cold. They recorded names of the dead, ages, causes. Frostbite, exposure, starvation, influenza. The columns grew long. Undertakers, overwhelmed, worked by candlelight, digging frozen ground with picks, coffins stacked like firewood awaiting burial. Families counted too, though their arithmetic was harsher. A mother looked at her surviving children and whispered the names of those gone. Her father stood by an empty bed, tallying what the storm had taken. One son, one daughter, the strength of his wife, the hope of spring. In poor cottages, death was measured not in coffins but in silences. Chairs left empty, bowls unfilled, voices missing from hymns. Newspapers demanded figures. Headlines shouted estimates. Thousands dead in cities, tens of thousands across the countryside. Editors argued whether hunger had killed more than cold, whether children had perished faster than old men. Numbers became weapons, flung between politicians seeking to prove or deny blame. But behind the numbers were stories. A girl frozen in her mother's arms at a church doorstep. A family found beneath a collapsed roof, their hands still clasped. Miners entombed not by rock, but by snow sealing the entrance to their pit. Soldiers in barracks, their uniforms stiff with frost. Their officers writing letters to widows by the dozens. The act of counting became a ritual of grief. Clergymen read lists of names aloud in churches, their voices breaking. Entire congregations wept, for nearly every family had lost someone. Bells tolled so often that they seemed to blend with the dripping of the thaw. And yet, even as names were written, many slipped through the cracks. Street children with no families to claim them, beggars found in doorways, laborers buried in drifts. These were entered simply as unknown. They were mourned by none but the record-keeper, yet their absence pressed on the city like invisible weight. Counting the lost was meant to bring closure. Instead, it revealed the storm's enormity. For how do you tally not only the dead but the lives broken, the futures erased, the dreams smothered? No ledger could contain such numbers. And so survivors carried them in memory, each step into spring shadowed by the silent arithmetic of grief. Survival was not victory. It was scarred on bodies, scars were plain. Frostbite left hands twisted, toes missing, ears scarred white. Men limped through factories, unable to climb ladders as they once had. Women stitched with fingers stiffened into claws. Children grew with crooked gaits, their skin marbled where cold had bitten deep. Every scar told a story, and every story began with the storm. Homes bore scars too. Roofs patched hastily with tin and timber showed jagged lines where snow had crushed them. Walls leaned inward where rafters had bowed. Windows were cracked, frames warped by ice. Smoke-blackened ceilings testified to weeks of choking fires. Even in summer, cottages smelled faintly of damp and soot, reminders that storms do not depart without leaving their mark. Memory carried the deepest scars. Survivors spoke of dreams haunted by the sound of the wind, of waking to phantom cold, of panic whenever snow began to fall again. Children who had watched siblings die grew into adults who never forgot. They told their own children not fairy tales but survival tales. Keep your fire alive. Never waste bread. Shoes are worth more than gold. Communities too were scarred. Trust had been tested, and not always passed. Some remembered the neighbor who shared coal, others the one who refused. Resentments lingered like frost in corners, while bonds forged in borrowed warmth endured for decades. Yet scars are not only disfigurement. They are proof of endurance. Men displayed their missing fingers like medals. Women spoke proudly of children saved despite hunger. The scars on homes became badges of resilience, patched roofs standing as monuments to survival. And in memory, scars carried lessons. They warned against complacency, urged preparation, demanded compassion. The storm's cruelty etched itself into the nation's collective story, shaping how future generations understood both nature's power and human fragility. In the end, scars were what remained when snow melted, when graves settled, when spring returned. Flesh healed crooked, homes leaned forever, memories ached in silence. But scars also meant we lived, we endured, we remember. If the storm revealed suffering, it revealed resilience even more. The poor who had the least to lose somehow endured what should have crushed them. They endured with invention. Rags became shoes, chairs became firewood, wallpaper paste became food. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap was transformed into survival. Where the wealthy complained of inconvenience, the poor invented solutions from nothing but desperation and grit. They endured with solidarity. Families huddled together, neighbors shared fires, strangers lent blankets. Soup kitchens, staffed by the poor themselves, fed thousands with little more than bones and water. Mothers gave up their own portions so children might live. Fathers worked until fingers bled, shoveling snow, hauling coal, carrying the sick. They endured with humor. Even in the worst nights, Laughter echoed from crowded rooms. Jokes about the cold, songs about frozen boots, games of pretending to be Arctic explorers, these moments kept despair at bay. Humor was not frivolity. It was armor they endured with faith. Churches filled, hymns rose above howling winds, prayers whispered over embers became the rhythm of life. Faith did not erase hunger or frostbite, but it gave meaning to survival, framing suffering as trial, endurance as victory, and above all, they endured with stubbornness. They refused to surrender, refused to let the storm dictate who lived and who died. Children marched barefoot through snow. Men dug tunnels between homes. Women nursed infants in rooms where frost grew on walls. They looked death in the face and said, "Not yet, not today." When spring came, it was the poor who emerged first, clearing streets, repairing roofs, planting fields. They carried scars, but also pride. They had endured not because of wealth, but because of will. Their resilience became legend, whispered in alleyways and written in parish records. Historians later wrote of the storm's devastation, of numbers lost, of cities paralyzed. But the poor remembered differently. They remembered the warmth of borrowed fires, the taste of thin soup shared among many, the strength of hands that refused to let go. For resilience is not the absence of suffering. It is the defiance that rises in its midst. And in that storm, the poor of Britain proved themselves unbreakable, enduring not because the world was kind, but because they were stronger than the cold that sought to erase them. When spring warmed Britain at last, survivors found themselves walking through two worlds, the one before the storm and the one after. Every ordinary act became charged with memory. To drink clean water, to lace boots, to sit by a fire without fear. These were no longer habits, but miracles. Children laughed at puddles, splashing until their stockings were soaked. Mothers did not scold. Instead, they smiled, for puddles meant thaw, not frostbite. Men grumbled at wet boots, yet kissed their wives when they returned, because boots intact were wealth beyond measure. Even the smell of damp earth, once nuisance, was received with gratitude. It was the smell of life resuming. The storm became a mirror against which people measured their blessings. A loaf of bread was not bread, but survival. A bed without lice was luxury. A night without dread was peace. The poor who had suffered most found themselves most grateful. They knew what it meant to lack, so they knew what it meant to have. And yet gratitude was complicated. Some carried bitterness, toward neighbors who had refused aid, toward landlords who had raised prices, toward officials who had looked away. Gratitude for survival mingled with resentment for injustice. The storm had revealed not only the generosity of the human spirit, but also its failures. Still, gratitude endured. Survivors gathered in churches, giving thanks with tears. Families visited graves, not only mourning but whispering words of thanks for those still living. Communities held feasts, meager though they were, celebrating endurance. Years later, when new winters came, parents told children, "Give thanks for fire. Give thanks for shoes. Give thanks for bread." And children rolled their eyes until they faced their first true cold and understood. The storm had become a permanent mirror, reflecting gratitude long after snow had melted. In towns and villages across Britain, the storm became story. Survivors recorded memories not just in ledgers, but in tales passed down through families like heirlooms. These stories became a kind of memory book for the nation. In one village, elders gathered children each winter and told of the year when snow buried doors, when people dug tunnels between houses, when the church bell froze silent. Children gasped, eyes wide, as if hearing a fairy tale. Yet the scars on their grandparents' hands proved it was no fiction. Families kept objects as relics: a cracked mug used to melt snow, a blanket patched from rags, a shoe worn through to nothing. These humble items became treasures, displayed with pride, each one carrying the weight of survival. Writers, too, recorded the storm. Newspapers published letters from farmers describing sheep lost in drifts, from mothers describing children saved by neighbors' fires. Poets wrote verses about silence and endurance. Painters sketched scenes of white wastelands, dotted with cottages like islands. The storm became not only memory but culture. Some stories were heroic, of men who carried sick neighbors miles through snow, of women who sheltered orphans in kitchens, barely big enough for their own families. Others were tragic, of children frozen on doorsteps, of roofs collapsing under weight, of hunger carving entire streets into graves. Together, these stories formed a book without pages, written in every town, read in every hearth. The memory book served a purpose. It taught children resilience, reminded adults of gratitude, warned leaders of their duty. It ensured that suffering was not wasted, but transformed into lesson. Villages may have buried their dead, but they refused to bury memory. Generations later, when snow fell, people repeated the stories. Remember the great storm. Remember how they endured. Remember how they survived. In this way, the storm never truly ended. It lived on in the village memory book, passed hand to hand, word to word, like fire carried across the dark. Every storm ends, but its lessons remain. The great winter of Victorian Britain taught a truth that outlasted snow, floods and scars. That survival depends not on wealth alone, but on solidarity, resilience and humility before nature. The wealthy learned that coal bins and cellars could empty, that velvet curtains could not stop frost, that money could not buy food when roads were impassable. The poor learned, as they always had, that suffering could be endured when endured together. Both learned that pride is brittle, but compassion is strong. The lesson was written in blood and frostbite, in hunger and hymns. It was whispered by children huddled under one quilt, by neighbors sharing embers, by mothers giving up food for their young. It was carved into homes patched after collapse, into scars carried on bodies, into the silence of graves. And it was simple. We are small, but together we endure. Future generations carried this lesson forward. Relief societies grew stronger. Churches expanded charity. Governments slowly, too slowly, acknowledged duty to protect the vulnerable. The storm had shown what happened when society failed, and that memory pushed reform. Even today, when storms come, people recall the great winter. They light candles, share food, check on neighbors. They know that nature cannot be commanded, but people can choose to stand together. The lesson remains not as fear, but as wisdom. That hardship is survivable, but only if we remember each other. Thus the storm, though long melted, still speaks. Its voice echoes in gratitude, in caution, in kindness. It reminds us that while snow may fall, while winds may howl, while roofs may bend, the human spirit, scarred though it may be, bends farther without breaking. That is the lesson that remains.